Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm Davide Mattone, I work for IBL and Il Foglio, and I'm pleased to welcome Peter Foster. Foster è un giornalista e autore anglo-canadese, ha studiato economia a Cambridge, ha lavorato al Financial Times a Londra e si è poi trasferito in Canada, dove è stato senior editor al Financial Post e dal 1998 è stato editorial columnist for il National Post. Nel corso della sua carriera ha scritto molto di economia, energia, impresa, politica economica e chiaramente capitalismo, con libri dedicati all'industria petrolifera canadese, al sistema bancario, alla storia di imprese Cuba, dove per esempio è stato più volte. Insomma, questa sera discutiamo il suo libro La psicologia dell'Anticapitalismo, perché disprezziamo la mano invisibile. Fresco fresco di stampa per IBL Libri, potete già acquistarlo su brunoleoni.it, al link in descrizione o su Amazon. Il titolo originale in inglese è Why We Buy the Invisible Hand, The Psychology of Anticapitalism. È un libro costruito intorno a un paradosso. L'economia di mercato ha prodotto un'enorme espansione della prosperità, della scelta, del benessere materiale e delle possibilità tecnologiche. Eppure il capitalismo continua a essere percepito come sospetto, come se molte persone non ne beneficiassero ogni giorno. Ricordo quella frase di Thatcher: You would prefer the poorer poorer than the richer richer. Quindi la domanda di Foster non è semplicemente poi perché alcune persone siano politicamente ostili al capitalismo, ma è molto più profonda, ma è perché facciamo fatica ad accettare i meccanismi, ma anche il risultato di quello che fa funzionare effettivamente una società commerciale. Grazie per essere con noi. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I should add, I must thank the Institute Bruno Leone for translating my book. I mean, it's a great honor, and I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
The honor is ours. So, Mr. Foster, this year marks the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations. Your book opens with a strong claim. Smith's invisible hand is not only invisible, for most people it is inconceivable, and for some, a dirty picture. So, after all this time, why is Smith's central insight still so hard to accept?
Well, it's hard to accept because it's very hard to understand. I should point out that this book is a sort of journey, both a physical journey and an intellectual journey, to answer that very question. Why don't people understand this system that has made them so wealthy and has produced so much wealth and welfare? So I decided that I should start this journey at Adam Smith's birthplace in Kirkcaldy in Scotland. And I went there in 1993 and I discovered that Adam Smith had just been cancelled. The local socialist council took away all the signs that said it was the birthplace of Adam Smith. Then when I went to the local library, I found out that Adam Smith's reputation was in the hands of Karl Marx and John Kenneth Galbraith, both of whom completely disagreed with him. So I saw that the fix was in. Now, part of the reason for that at that time was that Smith was associated very much with the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who was completely hated. Anyway, so I decided I had to pursue this venture. And Smith is probably more popular today, but he suffers perhaps as much from the people who support him as those who oppose him. There's an Adam Smith Global Foundation now in Kirkcaldy, which is run by socialists, in particular former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. And the Adam Smith Institute in London has an annual Ayn Rand lecture. Now, Ayn Rand was very insightful in many ways, but I think Adam Smith would think she was naive in her emphasis on rationality. One of the motivating factors, I mean, as I say, it started as a journey, was that I read this article called A Tale of Two Tombs, which pointed out that the tomb of Adam Smith in Edinburgh was in terrible condition and supported by the local council, whereas the tomb of Karl Marx at Highgate Cemetery in London was in a private cemetery and was very well maintained. So that gave me a sort of theme to go to Kirkcaldy, travel down to London via the sites of the Industrial Revolution and see what they told me, and then finish up at the tomb of Karl Marx. to get to the question of why, I mean, Smith, as I say, the invisible hand is not just misunderstood, but it is morally rejected. I should say what the invisible hand is first. Adam Smith uses it only, in fact, twice, but the great example he uses is the practical one. He says, nobody thinks it's strange that an ordinary man, a poor workman, has a coat. But if you look at how many industries and how much commerce goes into that coat, it amounts to the cooperation of literally thousands of people. But we don't think about it. Similarly, more recently, Friedrich Hayek wrote an essay called The Use of Knowledge in Society, in which he pointed out that what the invisible hand does is coordinate wants and needs of a multitude of people via the price system. The reason, but the point about the invisible hand is not that it's not just understood; it's morally rejected. So we have to look at morality. And Adam Smith wrote another great book, arguably as great as The Wealth of Nations, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he pointed out that the moral sentiments, were what made us sociable, but they were problematic when it came to what he calls faction and fanaticism. That is politics and religion. And I think the invisible hand's problem is that it is now being framed by moral assumptions that are out of date. It's meant to be all about greed and exploitation. It's meant to lead to unconscionable corporate power and terrible inequality. It's meant to lead to resource exhaustion and now climate catastrophe. And I believe that those things are not tenable.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe I will switch the question because you gave me an opening. So your book opens with the superstorm Sandy and the reaction against price increases. Anti-gouging rules irrationally looked moral, while prices that would have signaled scarcity were treated as exploitation. So the recent Gulf crisis, the closure of the Hormuz Straits, has put the same dilemma back on the table. We've seen in Italy and much of Europe, the political reflex has again been the intervention, as it is likely the result of electoral pressure over policymakers. Why are price signals still so hard to defend precisely when they might be most useful?
Again, because people do not understand the function of prices. I mean, when they see prices go up, they automatically think, it must be the greed of businessmen. So businessmen are hauled before parliaments and senates to explain themselves. And they usually do a very bad job of explaining themselves. One of the themes in my book is how terrible businessmen are at supporting free enterprise. In a way, they're not interested in supporting free enterprise is not their main business. They want to run their businesses. So if they're in a corrupt system, there is a danger that they themselves will become corrupt. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter said, well, was it more than 70 years ago, that he thought capitalism would collapse because ownership would be diverse, innovation would be routinized, but most of all, capitalists would support people who were undermining them. Now they give money to environmental, non-governmental organizations. All the great capitalist foundations from Rockefeller onwards have been captured. And to try and give themselves a better name, businesses fall for these ideas like corporate social responsibility and sustainability. But the key question is corporate social responsibility to whom and for what? Milton Friedman pointed out that corporate social responsibility was a very dangerous idea because it opened businessmen to infinite demands. It was not their business to get involved in politics. Their business was to look after their shareholders and their customers and their employees and their communities, and not to get involved in trying to save the world via global salvationism, which was a phrase that David Henderson came up with for this idea that business had a responsibility beyond business, but that way lie dragons.
Okay, thank you so much. Reading your books again, like especially this one, it has made me thought a lot. And let me take the chance to show again this beautiful book. So, particularly in the chapter on do-it-yourself economics, you draw on David Anderson's idea that many economic fallacies are universal, like time and deeply held. Exports are good, imports are dangerous, natural production must be protected, labor-saving technology destroyed jobs, and we will get to there with AI later. From Trump's tariffs last year to buy European-style policies this year, these intuitions seem to be back in power. Like, if the explanation really is evolutionary, the hunter-gatherer mind resurfacing, are we condemned to repeat them forever? Like, has ever in history ever managed to break them? Or like, do you recall a particular fact, a particular history about this?
Well, there is a turn backwards occasionally from the drift to the left. I mean, Reaganism and Thatcherism in the 1980s struck back, but generally the pendulum always swings left. And do-it-yourself economics stays with people because it's based on Pleistocene assumptions. I mean, we are hunter-gatherers with cell phones. So we have these flawed ideas, and they are encouraged by politicians because they're very useful politicians. And we don't need to understand the invisible hand anymore. We need to read a book of biology in order to stay alive. It's a natural system. And so we benefit from it while supporting policies which are dangerous and damaging for it. I mean, the field of economics has been thoroughly corrupted by politicians because they prefer the advice of activists. They don't want to hear from economists who say, don't do that because it will have bad results. They don't want to hear from the Friedrich Hayeks or the Ludwig von Mises. They want to hear from John Maynard Keynes or John Kenneth Galbraith or Thomas Piketty, who tell them that they must interfere both for economic and moral reasons. I use the example, people don't seem to be able to understand the difference between the Forbes 400, that is the 400 richest people in America, and the court of Louis XIV. The difference is that the Forbes 400 mostly, almost entirely earned the money, and they earned it by serving others. The court of Louis XIV were a bunch of robbers, essentially, who all gained their power and position through war and exploitation. And yet, people still retain this primitive view of wealth, which, as I say, is very useful to socialists. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of the US recently, said that you can't be a billionaire without being a criminal, essentially. And then you've got Zoran Mandami, the new mayor of New York, who's also demonizing the rich. I mean, the rich are always there to be demonized, but very seldom strike back. In fact, one did in New York when his apartment, his $240 million apartment, was used by Mamdani, and he pointed out that he not only had a $240 million apartment, he was involved in billions of dollars of investment in New York. And if you demonize the rich, then they might just go somewhere else.
There is something I wanted to ask you. Like, when you mention activists actively influencing policymaker, do you think that do you think that social media are increasing this effect of putting policymaker under our never-ending political campaign? They're always under the public scrutiny, whatever they do, whatever they say, whatever they mention, and that also is reflected on their political choices and fiscal choices.
Yes, I mean, the thing is that the power of social media has come along since I published the book, but I'd already mentioned the power of environmental NGOs and how they were deliberately promoted in order to pressure corporations. And corporations, as I said, were not very good at defending themselves. So now you have these influencers. The thing that strikes me is there are so many of them, but obviously they have more power, and they spread ignorance about the capitalist system.
There is like correlation, maybe, nor I'm not saying there is a causation between the merging like social media and the emerging populist movements throughout the world, especially in the
Yeah. But I mean, in a way, I mean, the populism is a sort of a backlash against dangerous trends. I mean, populists are despised because they may well share do-it-yourself economic beliefs, but the backlash is against social policies. I mean, the biggest thing that came along since my book is Donald Trump. And he's the most polarizing figure, but he was necessary to do certain things. He's done some good things. For example, stopping defunding the police, closing the borders, or stopping completely free flow over the borders, and opposing things like transgenderism. But his economic policies, I mean, would have made Adam Smith spin in his grave, because he's a big fan of tariffs, and not just to counter Chinese tariffs, because he thinks tariffs are good policy, and he also believes in industrial strategy, which Adam Smith did not. So I mean, it's a very mixed picture when it comes to populism. I mean, it's happening in Britain. I mean, I think to a certain extent it's happened in Italy as well, isn't it? I mean, Giorgio Meloni is much more to the right than previous politicians. I think she's doing well.
I mean, I will not will not. It's very particular here. I will not. It's very difficult to like comment nowadays Italy foreign policy and internal domestic policy. We can say now we have a pretty much European policy aligned with your other European partners. But yeah, but at least in the US, I see like this dichotomy of people biting the invisible hand, seeing as suspicious. People are embracing it. I mean, let's look at the stock market. Everybody thinks it's efficient. However, we've seen recent cases about Trump and this accusation of like insider trading. Like, how do you see this dichotomy, at least in the US?
Well, no, I mean, there is much more support, I think, for free enterprise in the US than elsewhere. But as I say, Trump is a problematic supporter of free enterprise because he doesn't support free enterprise, basically. And he's reasonably corrupt, although most politicians are corrupt. And also, I should never have mentioned Italian politics because I just do not know enough about it. So I'm sorry about that.
You put me like in such a bad position, right? Okay, we can go on the next question. So since we are talking about social media, so in your book, you're very skeptical of political projects that turn fear into a demand for control. And the AI debate is increasingly framed through catastrophe, extinction risk, China's control, preemptive regulation, and global coordination. We've seen this lately with the rare earth. So Anthropic, the society that owns Claude, one of the most used AI software, has just published a policy paper, so 2028 choose scenarios for global AI leadership, arguing that democracies must preserve their compute advantage over China and shape AI norms before authoritarian regimes do. What's your take on this? Like, once again, the Lotus calls for global governance for the good of humanity come from the largest incumbents and from technocrats who would administer it. Is this familiar to you? Is this a familiar partner to a reader of your book? And where do you draw the line between legitimate regulation of a powerful technology such as AI? We've seen its implication regarding like domestic control and accusation regarding Palantir and the moralized centralism you describe?
Well, the question perhaps isn't how much regulation is legitimate or desirable, it's how much regulation is possible. And if we look at the history of regulation, I mean, we need rules, and there are certainly matters of national security when it comes to AI. But I tend to think that the threat of AI is overestimated outside the area of national security, where it's very important. In Smithian or in terms of biting the invisible hand, it's a great example of the fear of technological unemployment. The great fear of AI is that it is going to get rid of all our jobs, and that fear has come along many, many times in the past. But we always find new jobs. The problem is people don't know what's coming next, and since they can't think of what's coming next, they think, "Oh, nothing's coming next. It's a crisis." One area I'm worried about AI is what it does to information and misinformation, which gets back to the social media element. George Orwell said, "Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past." And I've gone to Google recently, and I've looked up a few things. And there's always the problem of garbage in, garbage out. I mean, AI is meant to absorb most of what's written, but I think it could be biased, and that's dangerous.
So do you think the fear of AI has been greatly exaggerated?
Well, I mean, I just don't know. All I can do is, compare it to technological fears of the past. I mean, it does seem truly an astonishing technology.
A revolutionary.
But it's the idea that somehow governments, or even worse, global governors, should be controlling this technology, like the people at Davos and like the World Economic Forum should be controlling it, and that's a terrible idea. I mean, I think you mentioned the global governors, or the aspiring global governors. They are very dangerous people, although they are somewhat in retreat at the moment. They used COVID as an opportunity to claim that now is the time for a Green New Deal to build back better. But of course, then they messed up COVID policy. So, I mean, they didn't look so good, which I think is a great thing. But yeah, I mentioned in the book that Canada is always striving to punch above its weight, to use an objectionable term. But an area in which Canada has produced outstanding individuals is in global governance, particularly in a man called Maurice Strong. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with him. And now with his successor, Mark Carney, who's the Prime Minister of Canada. Mark Carney was his part. Mark Carney has a desire, I think, it's almost Leninist, to seize the commanding heights of finance. Lenin wanted to seize the commanding heights of industry, but Carney had a very clear and clearly expressed plan that he would control the banking system via things like ESG and BEI, which were the successors to CSR and sustainability. And he would control them by forcing them to measure the immeasurable and essentially to tie them down. But there's been a backlash against that. Again, fortunately, in the US, I mean, largely because of Donald Trump, although Donald Trump, as I said, is not the greatest defender of free enterprise. But in this case, he's done the world a favor by turning back this financial initiative.
No, yeah, I'm thinking back in my time at ECB, I recall climate risk. They still didn't know how to frame it, whether it should be within the mandate. Then, it was a hard topic. Now we completely switched towards like another completely policy stance, especially because I guess needs and desirability don't always, match. Something else that particularly strike my interest is your experience in Cuba, because you've wrote an entire book on the Bacardi family and the expropriation of their business by Castro's regime. And now Cuba is in everyday newspaper, like front page. Cuba particularly returns in this book as an example of political coercion wrapped in a revolutionary moral language. But Cuba today is facing a severe economic and demographic crisis. Official data showing like a declining population of more than 10% between 2020 and 2024. What does it tell us about like what does Cuba tell us today that it is not already told us 30 years ago? And what does Cuba still teach us about the Western temptation to excuse political failure, even when it hurts people, when it comes wrapped in anti-capitalist ideals and ideas?
Well, I mean, I think Cuba had everything it has to tell us perhaps closer to 70 years ago, after the revolution. I mean, Fidel Castro promised freedom and he delivered tyranny. One of the reasons I wrote the Bacardi book, one of the things that interested me was it showed how ridiculous this claim is that corporations have as much power as governments. The Cuban government had no trouble expropriating Bacardi. Corporations and governments are not similar in terms of power. Corporations can't put you in jail. As part of the research for that book and what spilled over into this book is that I went to Cuba somewhat naively to research the Bacardis. And in Toronto, I met a Cuban couple called Ignacio and Ileana. And they had escaped Cuba by pretending to be wonderful communists. And the reward because they knew that the reward for a wonderful communist was to go to see Lenin's tomb in Moscow. So on the way to Moscow, they got off the plane in Canada, again in Newfoundland. Anyway, I met them and I told them I was going to Cuba. So they said, please take some goods and some American dollars to our family because Cuban money is worthless. The American dollar has power in the black market. So, I went off. So I was smuggling American dollars and I met their family. And I remember the father took me to one side and said, he'd learned this piece of English. He said, we live in a big prison. And yet people still supported this dreadful economy. But anyway, the piece that's relevant for this book is that when I came back, it was a very hot summer, I think at the end of the 80s. And Ignacio and Ileana had gone out to look for an air conditioner. And they had found one, but it had taken them all day. And Ignacio said to me, you know what's wrong with the Canadian system? There should be more planning. So this guy, because he hadn't been able to get an air conditioner immediately, wanted to turn the Canadian system over to the Cuban system. In fact, he had been a state planner himself. But I didn't think that was the problem. The problem was that most people, it goes back to doing sort of economics, they have this sort of unreflecting centralist view that things would be better planned from the top. And if you look at history, this has been nothing but, complete disaster. My experience with Ignacio and the air conditioner was one of the inciting incidents for this book before it came along. But I should mention the other one, which was an even more important example of why we not just buy it, but why we don't understand the invisible hand. I went to Moscow, where Ignacio and Ileana were headed but never reached in 1991. And it was meant because there was meant to be a celebration of the first anniversary of Moscow McDonald's. Now, the celebration was cancelled, because the Soviet Union had already fallen apart and there was chaos everywhere. But I turned up anyway. And it was just fascinating. I came to have complete admiration for the McDonald's organization, which was just phenomenal. I mean, their restaurant on Pushkin Square was like this wonderful sea of organization in a side of organization, an island of organization in a sea of entropy. But the really important thing for me was that talking to the Moscow McDonald's employees who were from North America was that they realized for the first time how much they'd taken the invisible hand for granted. I mean, everywhere else that McDonald's operated on Earth, it relied on thousands of suppliers who effortlessly came forward whenever McDonald's put anything out to tender to supply it. But now in the Soviet Union, there were no suppliers. There was no initiative because it had been a crime for whatever, 70 years. So again, that was an important insight for me, that you only appreciate the invisible hand when it's not there.
So, because people see the product, but not the invisible like order that makes it possible, right?
No, they just take it for granted. I mean,
They just see the burger.
Yeah, they go to the supermarket and they see 20,000 products and they don't think that's wonderful. I mean, in Adam Smith, I mentioned his, the coat, the fact that he thought it was a wonder that this coat should have been produced by the collective effort of the market. But in his day, the meal plan at the University of Glasgow, where he taught, was a sack of oatmeal. I mean, you were wealthy if you had a pair of shoes. He would be stunned if it was to come to the present and, see the modern world in all its wonder. An example, I mean, there are lots of examples of how rich we've become. But I used a particular example by a very great writer called Matt Ridley, who pointed out that poor people in America, this is some years ago, most of them had running water, refrigerators, television, a telephone, flush toilets. And his point was that Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the so-called robber barons, in fact, a great benefactor of mankind, had none of these things. So that was a measure of how much poor people lived so much better than the rich people of just, 100 or more years ago.
And if you could add a chapter now, after all these developments, after AI, technological innovation, the final rise of China and the decline of Russia, what would it be?
Well, I mean, I think you've just summed it up. It would be updating my book to say how all these things fitted in. I mean, geopolitical things. China is fascinating, and people think it's an example of how there's a method superior to the invisible hand. China became rich because by releasing people. I mean, the problem with China for the world isn't capitalism; it's kind of communism's revenge. Suddenly all these very clever, hardworking people were released. They are the capitalists, and Donald Trump is right that they had to be taken on because they don't obey by the rules. They don't, they steal intellectual property and they engage in surveillance. I mean, those things are amazing. I mean, in a way, the fact that all these things have happened in the 12 years since my book was published, make the point how fast and far things go in capitalist society. So I guess maybe I should revise the book and write another chapter.
I'm gonna read it for sure. But one final question. Do you feel like part of Chinese society can grasp better the success of, which is also a banality of capitalism, which is also part of the reason people fail to value it? Like, people don't grasp the success of it, so they criticize it. They see it, as a dirty picture. Do you feel like in China, since it is a different system, do you feel like the civil society, as a result of many different, matters, has a different view of it?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a much more repressive society. I mean, the original idea of letting China into the World Trade Organization and doing business with them, as we're doing business with post-Soviet Russia, was a rather naive idea that if you get rid of, if you open up things, that people will eventually become democrats. Well, that might be true, but so far it seems naive because the Chinese have used that unleashing of capitalist ingenuity to build a military. Similarly, Russia is an even bigger example of the failure of free enterprise to take on, because oligarchs were allowed to grab assets rather than there to be a free society, and that enabled Putin to come in and expropriate them, and thus he did seize the commanding heights of much of the economy. But Putin couldn't be further from free enterprise. Although he has taken advantage of the little free enterprise that there is. Oh, and it's also worth mentioning that Moscow McDonald's went on to be a great success in Russia, except after the invasion of Ukraine, it withdrew from the country. So somebody once said that its entry into Russia or into the old Soviet Empire had been an example of its fatal optimism. And unfortunately, in the end, they were right.
E grazie mille a Peter Foster per essere stato con noi. Il libro è La psicologia dell'Anticapitalismo, perché disprezziamo la mano invisibile. È veramente fresco di stampa di IBL Libri, lo trovate su Amazon, lo trovate sull'Istituto e mi raccomando, è una lettura che non può mancare. È assolutamente un libro che deve esserci sulla vostra libreria.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Grazie mille a tutti.